In the memories of millions of Americans, Tommy Kirk is immortal. He is the symbol of childhood, the brave boy with the rifle and the broken heart. But reality is more cruel than any tragic movie. The year is 1982. There are no more stage lights, no more red carpets, only the loud sound of vacuum cleaners and the strong smell of chemicals. The golden boy is now a 40-year-old man, old before his time, going door to door asking to clean up other people's stains. The moment the woman realizes her idol is kneeling at her feet, it is not joy, it is horror. It is the moment she realizes Hollywood not only creates dreams, it also crushes people and dumps their bodies into the garbage dump of reality. The story truly begins far from the glitter of Hollywood in the hard-scrabble reality of Louisville, Kentucky, where Thomas Lee Kirk was born on December 10th, 1941, just 3 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He was a war baby, born into a world on fire and into a home that was already burning. His father, Lewis Kirk, was a mechanic. He was a man of his time, hard-working, rough-handed, and deeply troubled. He worked for the highway department, fixing the machinery that paved the roads of America. But Louis fought a private war that he was losing, a war with the bottle. Alcoholism in the 1940s wasn't treated with therapy or rehab. It was a shadow that lived in the house, a volatile presence that could turn a quiet evening into a storm of shouting and broken glass. His mother, Lucy, was different. She was a stenographer, a woman of sharp intelligence and sharper ambition. She looked at her life in Kentucky, the dust, the grease, the limited horizons, and she felt suffocated. She looked at her sons, Tommy and his brother Joe, and she didn't just see children. She saw potential. She saw a ticket out. When Tommy was just a toddler, the family joined the Great Migration westward. They packed their belongings and headed for the Promised Land, Los Angeles. But they didn't land in Beverly Hills. They landed in East Los Angeles, a working-class neighborhood that was a melting pot of cultures and struggles. The dynamic in the Kirk household was established early, and it is a dynamic we see in the biographies of almost every tragic child star. The father was often absent, either physically or emotionally, lost in the fog of drink. The mother became the general, the manager, the driving force. Tommy was a sensitive child. He was quiet, observant, and possessed of a strange adult-like gravity. He wasn't the show-off type. He didn't dance on tables for attention. He had a melancholy about him, a stillness that was unusual for a boy his age. Lucy Kirk saw something in that face. In Los Angeles, beauty is a currency, and the Kirk family was broke. This is the uncomfortable truth of the stage parent phenomenon. It is easy to villainize them as greedy monsters, but often they were simply desperate. In a time before social safety nets, a talented child was a lottery ticket. If the kid could land a commercial, the rent got paid. If the kid could land a movie, the family could buy a house. Tommy became the family's investment strategy. I started working when I was 5 years old. Tommy would later recall, his voice void of nostalgia. I didn't have a choice. It was just what we did. He wasn't playing. He was working. While other boys were learning to ride bicycles or play stickball, Tommy was learning to stand on a mark. He was learning to memorize lines. He was learning to suppress his own boredom, his own fatigue, and his own childish desires to please the adults in the room. He attended auditions with the grim determination of a breadwinner. He learned early on that his parents' mood, especially his mother's approval and his father's temper, depended largely on whether he got the part. Success meant peace in the house. Failure meant tension. For a child, this is a devastating psychological burden. It wires the brain to believe that love is conditional. You are not loved because you exist. You are loved because you perform. And Tommy performed perfectly. In 1954, The family moved to Downey, California. It was a step up, but the pressure didn't alleviate. Tommy began to land small roles in television, appearing in episodes of TV Reader's Digest and matinee theater. He was good. He had an instinctive naturalism. He didn't act like the other kids in Hollywood who had been trained to flash polished, fake smiles. Tommy looked like a real person. He looked like he had a secret. That quality caught the eye of a casting director for the most important production in town, the Mickey Mouse Club. In 1955, Disney was looking for kids. They were casting for a serial called The Hardy Boys, The Mystery of the Applegate Treasure. They needed a Joe Hardy, a boy who was inquisitive, brave, but relatable. Tommy auditioned. He didn't have the polish of the studio-groomed kids. He had a roughness, a street-smart quality from growing up in East L.A. He walked into the audition room not with the desperation to please, but with a quiet confidence. Walt Disney saw the tape. Walt was a genius at casting. He didn't just look for acting ability, he looked for spirit. He looked for something in the eyes that the camera could fall in love with. In Tommy Kirk, he saw the every boy. He saw a face that every mother could trust and every kid could want to be friends with. Tommy got the part. The contract was signed, the ink dried, and just like that, the trap snapped shut. Tommy Kirk was now property of the Walt Disney Company. The early days were heady. Filming the Hardy Boys was fun. It was an adventure. But success at Disney came with a specific set of chains. Walt Disney took a personal interest in Tommy. He famously called Tommy his good luck charm. Think about the weight of that title. You are 14 years old. The most famous man in the world looks you in the eye and tells you that you are his talisman. You are the magic ingredient. It is intoxicating, it is flattering, and it is terrifying. Because luck can run out, and charms can be discarded. As 1956 turned into 1957, Disney was preparing to make a move that would change the history of cinema. Old Yeller. They needed a star who could carry a movie that wasn't about cartoons. They needed a star who could make the audience feel pain. They looked at their good luck charm. They looked at the boy with the sad eyes and the volatile home life. Get Tommy Kirk, they said. He's the one. Little did they know, they were handing him the gun that would make him a legend, and the fame that would eventually kill the boy inside the man. The year 1957 did not just bring a role, it brought a reckoning. When Walt Disney decided to adapt Fred Gibson's novel Old Yeller, the studio was taking a significant gamble. Up until that moment, the Disney brand was largely synonymous with fantasy, singing princesses, flying elephants, and animated mice. Live-action films were a secondary venture, often light adventures or nature documentaries. But Old Yeller was different. It was gritty. It was set in the unforgiving post-Civil War Texas frontier, a place of dirt, sweat, and danger. It was a story that demanded an emotional gravity that cartoons simply couldn't provide. The central role of Travis Coates was not merely a part for a child actor to recite lines. Travis was the man of the house, a teenager forced to grow up too fast because his father was away on a cattle drive. He had to manage the farm, protect his family, and ultimately make a life and death decision that would break his heart. It was a role that required a profound reservoir of sadness, a maturity that bordered on weariness. Walt Disney looked at his good luck charm and decided to bet the house on him. He saw in Tommy Kirk's eyes a depth that the other Mouseketeers lacked. The other kids on the lot were trained to smile with their teeth. Tommy smiled with a hesitation that suggested he knew the world wasn't always a happy place. Filming began, and the pressure was immediate. For a 15-year-old boy, the set of Old Yeller was a crucible. The director, Robert Stevenson, was a professional who demanded authenticity. He didn't treat Tommy like a child. He treated him like the lead actor of a major motion picture. The days were long, filled with the dust and heat of the California location standing in for Texas. But it was the climax of the film that would define Tommy's life forever. The scene is etched into the cultural DNA of America. The moment Travis Coates realizes his beloved dog, the yellow cur that saved his life, has been infected with hydrophobia, rabies. The dog is dangerous. The dog has to be put down, and Travis knows he cannot let his mother do it. He cannot let his little brother do it. It is his dog. It is his burden. When the cameras rolled for that final devastating sequence, something shifted in the atmosphere of the set. Tommy stood there, the heavy rifle in his hands, looking at the animal. When the tears came, they didn't look like Hollywood glycerin. They were jagged. They were ugly. They were real. Decades later, in quiet moments of reflection, Tommy would admit that he wasn't just crying for the dog. He was crying for himself. He was channeling the confusion of his own adolescence, the crushing weight of his parents' expectations, the loneliness of being a breadwinner before he was old enough to drive. He poured all the anxiety of the Kirk household, the shouting matches, the financial fears, the desperation to please, into that one moment of fictional tragedy. He pulled the trigger, and in doing so, he shattered the hearts of an entire generation. The release of Old Yeller in December 1957 was a seismic event. It wasn't just a movie, it was a rite of passage. In theaters across the country, the lights would go down, and for the first time, millions of baby boomers learned about death. They learned that being good didn't save you. They learned that sometimes you have to kill the thing you love most. And the face of that hard lesson was Tommy Kirk. The critical reception was rapturous. Critics, who usually dismissed Disney fare as fluff, were forced to acknowledge the raw power of the performance. The box office returns were staggering. The film became a cultural phenomenon, and Tommy Kirk was catapulted into the stratosphere of fame. He was no longer just a working actor, he was a star. He was the ideal American boy, stoic, responsible, sensitive, and brave. But fame is a strange isolator. While other 16-year-olds were worrying about prom dates and algebra, Tommy was worrying about box office receipts and public appearances. He was thrust into a world of adults, treated with a deference that was confusing and a scrutiny that was terrifying. He was the prince of the studio, and Walt was the king. Walt Disney's affection for Tommy grew during this period. To Walt, Tommy represented the perfect bridge between the wholesome innocence of the past and the profitable future of live-action cinema. Walt was a man who valued loyalty and success, and Tommy had delivered both in spades. There was a paternal warmth in their interactions, a sense that Tommy had been adopted into the inner circle of the Magic Kingdom. For a boy whose own father was often lost in the bottle, Walt's approval was a potent drug. It was the validation he craved above all else. Yet this approval came with implicit conditions. To be Walt's favorite meant adhering to Walt's code, and the code was strict: absolute normalcy, absolute wholesomeness. You could be a star, but you could not be a scandal. You belonged to the public, and the public demanded a mirror image of their own idealized values. Disney wasted no time in capitalizing on their new golden boy. They needed to prove that Tommy wasn't a one-hit wonder, that he could do comedy as well as tragedy. In 1959, they cast him in The Shaggy Dog. On paper, the premise was ridiculous. A teenage boy finds a magic ring and turns into a sheepdog. It was the kind of script that could have easily been a disaster, but Tommy played it with a straight-faced sincerity that grounded the absurdity. He played Wilby Daniels not as a caricature, but as a misunderstood teenager who just happened to be growing fur. The film was shot in black and white on a modest budget. But when it hit theaters, it exploded. The Shaggy Dog became the absolute highest-grossing film of 1959, earning more money than epics like Ben-Hur in terms of sheer profitability ratio. It literally saved the Disney studio from a cash flow slump and financed the expansion of Disneyland. Tommy Kirk was now 2 for 2. He had delivered the biggest tearjerker of the decade and the biggest comedy of the year. He was untouchable. He was the boy next door who could do no wrong. He was on the cover of teen magazines, his face plastered alongside Ricky Nelson and Elvis Presley. But unlike Elvis with his dangerous hips or Ricky with his rockabilly pout, Tommy was safe. He was the boy you could bring home to mother. This public image of safety was the cage that was slowly tightening around him. The higher his star rose, the more he felt the suffocation of the persona he had helped create. He was living inside a hall of mirrors. Everywhere he looked, he saw Travis Coates or Wilby Daniels. He saw the good boy. But when he looked in the mirror at home, alone in the bathroom with the door locked, he saw a stranger. He was beginning to realize that his feelings were not like the other boys. He found himself looking a little too long at the male extras on set, feeling a pull that terrified him. In the hyper-masculine, deeply conservative culture of the late 1950s, there was no language for what he was feeling, at least no language that wasn't poisoned with words like pervert or deviant. He buried these feelings deep, layering them under the thick concrete of his work ethic. He told himself it was a phase. He told himself he could act his way out of it, just like he acted his way through a script. In 1960, the studio upped the ante again. They cast him in the most ambitious live-action project in their history, Swiss Family Robinson. This was not a backlot shoot in Burbank. This was an expedition. The production was moved to the island of Tobago in the West Indies. It was a massive undertaking, a logistical nightmare of building treehouses, wrangling exotic animals, and managing a cast and crew in a tropical climate. For Tommy, now 18 years old, Tobago was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was an adventure. He was young, rich, and famous, living on a tropical island. On the other hand, it was isolation. Far away from the watchful eyes of his parents and the immediate oversight of the studio executives in California, the cracks in his armor began to widen. The filming was grueling. The heat was oppressive. But amidst the chaos of the production, there was a sense of freedom he had never tasted before. The island air was different. The rules of suburban California felt a million miles away. It was here, in the lush humidity of the Caribbean, that the boy began to wrestle with the man he was becoming. He was cast opposite Kevin Corcoran, his on-screen brother from Old Yeller, and James MacArthur. They were the triumvirate of Disney sons. But Tommy always felt slightly apart. He described himself later as feeling like an alien observer, watching the other young men talk about girls, about the future, about things that felt accessible to them, but forbidden to him. Despite the internal turmoil, his performance in Swiss Family Robinson was another triumph. He played Ernst, the intellectual brother, the thinker. It was a role that fit his own introspective nature. When the film was released, it was yet another smash hit. It seemed that Tommy Kirk could not fail. He had the Midas touch. By 1961, Tommy Kirk was a millionaire, or at least he generated millions. The money he earned supported his entire family. It bought the cars, it paid the mortgages, it kept his father's demons at bay, or at least kept them funded. This financial reality added a terrifying weight to his existence. He wasn't just working for himself, he was the engine of a small economy. If he stopped, everything stopped. If he fell, everyone fell. The pressure to maintain the illusion was crushing. The Disney publicity machine was relentless. They set him up on dates with Annette Funicello, the studio's reigning princess. Annette was sweet, kind, and genuinely fond of Tommy. They were friends, but to the cameras they were the dream couple. The press loved it. The fans devoured it. Tommy played the part. He smiled. He held her hand. He gave interviews talking about his ideal girl. He lied with the proficiency of a master spy. But every lie took a sliver of his soul. Every time he pretended to be the heartthrob the world wanted, he felt a little more invisible. He began to seek outlets for the mounting anxiety. It started small. A drink to take the edge off after a long day of shooting. A pill to help him sleep when his mind wouldn't stop racing. The doctors in Hollywood were generous with prescriptions for their stars. If you needed to be up, they had a pill. If you needed to be down, they had a pill. Tommy found that the chemical haze was a comfortable place to hide. It dulled the fear. It quieted the voice in his head that whispered he was a fraud. He was moving through the world like a ghost in a golden shell. To the outside observer, he had everything a young man could dream of. He was handsome, wealthy, and beloved by millions. He drove fast cars and wore expensive clothes. But inside the chest of the boy who cried for Old Yeller, a dark, cold winter was setting in. He was beginning to venture out at night, driving his car away from the bright lights of the premieres and into the shadows of Los Angeles. He was looking for something, connection, validation, or perhaps just a reflection of himself that didn't feel like a special effect. He found the hidden bars. He found the secret societies of men who lived in the dark. It was a dangerous game. In Los Angeles in the early 60s, the police vice squads were prowling. A raid on a gay bar wasn't just an inconvenience. It was front-page news. It was career suicide. It was a prison sentence. Every time Tommy stepped into that world, he was betting his entire life on the spin of a wheel. But the compulsion was stronger than the fear. The need to be known, to be truly seen, even for a fleeting moment in a dimly lit room, was overpowering the instinct for self-preservation. He was walking a tightrope over a canyon, and the wind was picking up. Meanwhile, back at the studio, the scripts kept coming. The Absent-Minded Professor, Babes in Toyland, Moon Pilot. The machine didn't stop. It demanded more product. It demanded more smiles. It demanded that Tommy Kirk remain eternally the boy who could do no wrong. He was 20 years old now. He was legally an adult. But in the eyes of the studio, and in the eyes of the public, he was still a child. He was frozen in amber, trapped in a perpetual adolescence that he had long outgrown. The cognitive dissonance was becoming deafening. The gap between the Disney legend and the human being was widening into a chasm, and it was only a matter of time before he fell into it. The cracks were invisible to the audience, masked by the technicolor brightness of the screen. But those close to him, the makeup artists who covered the dark circles under his eyes, the directors who noticed the trembling of his hands before a take, they saw the signs. The good luck charm was running out of luck. The golden boy was beginning to tarnish. And Walt, the father figure, the man who sat in the high tower of the animation building, was watching too. He was watching his investment. And in the corporate calculus of the Magic Kingdom, a flawed asset was a liability that eventually had to be written off. By 1962, the cultural tectonic plates of America were beginning to shift. The sleepy conformity of the Eisenhower years was giving way to the energetic, youthful promise of the Kennedy administration. Rock and roll had evolved from a dangerous novelty into the dominant language of youth. The Beach Boys were singing about surfing in California, painting a picture of a sun-drenched utopia that teenagers across the country were desperate to inhabit. But inside the gates of the Walt Disney Studios in Burbank, time stood still. It was a kingdom hermetically sealed against the changing tides, a place where the values of 1950 remained absolute law. And Tommy Kirk, now 21 years old, was the living, breathing avatar of that frozen time. He was trapped in a paradox of aging. Biologically, he was a grown man. He had the desires, the complexities, and the frustrations of an adult, but professionally, he was locked in a state of suspended animation. To the studio and consequently to the world, he was still the eternal teenager, the bumbling but good-hearted kid next door who never grew up, never swore, and certainly never harbored dark secrets. He was forced to wear a mask of perpetual adolescence that was becoming increasingly heavy to hold up. The joyous boyishness that had come naturally to him in the Hardy Boys was now a performance, a suit of armor he strapped on every morning before walking onto the soundstage. This friction between the man he was and the boy he was paid to be began to manifest in his work. In 1963, Disney released Savage Sam, the sequel to Old Yeller. It was a calculated attempt to recapture the lightning that had struck 5 years earlier. Tommy was once again cast as Travis Coates, but the magic had curdled. The film was harsher, more violent, lacking the soulful innocence of the original. Watching it, one can sense a weariness in Tommy's performance. He is going through the motions, hitting his marks, delivering his lines with professional competence, but the light behind the eyes is dimmer. He wasn't just playing a character anymore. He was playing a caricature of his younger self. It was a ghostly experience, like walking through a museum of his own past life while he was still living it. Off-screen, the isolation was deepening. The camaraderie of the Mickey Mouse Club days was gone. The other Mouseketeers had moved on or faded away. Annette Funicello remained a constant presence, a beacon of kindness in his life, but their relationship was complicated by the studio's machinery. The publicity department continued to push the narrative of a romance between them, orchestrating dates and photo opportunities to feed the fan magazines. They were the king and queen of the Disney prom, a sanitized fantasy of young love. Tommy played along because he had to, but the deception gnawed at him. He respected Annette too much to enjoy using her as a shield. He knew, with a sinking dread, that he was deceiving not just the public, but the people who cared about him. He was living a lie so comprehensive that he sometimes struggled to remember where the fabrication ended and the truth began. The strain of maintaining this beard relationship, using a woman to hide his sexuality, added another layer of guilt to his already fragile psyche. He felt like a fraud, a counterfeit coin circulating in the economy of wholesome American values. It was during this period that the secret life moved from the periphery to the center of his existence. The fear of being discovered was paralyzed by the desperate, clawing need for human connection. Los Angeles in the early 1960s had a gay underground, but it was a world of shadows, codes, and terrifying risks. It wasn't the open, celebratory culture that would emerge decades later. It was a twilight world of speakeasies, private house parties in the Hollywood Hills, and coded glances in public places. Tommy began to drift into this world, driven by a hunger he could no longer suppress. He discovered places like the specialized bars in West Hollywood or Santa Monica, places with blacked-out windows and back entrances. Entering these spaces was like stepping onto a different planet. For a few hours, the mask could slip. He didn't have to be Travis Coates. He didn't have to be the Disney prince. He could just be a young man looking for affection. But even in these sanctuaries, he couldn't fully relax. He was too famous. Heads turned when he walked in. Whispers followed him. "Isn't that the kid from Shaggy Dog?" The recognition was a double-edged sword. It made him a prize to some, a liability to others. He was terrified of a police raid. The Los Angeles Police Department Vice Squad was notoriously aggressive during this era, frequently raiding gay bars, arresting patrons, and publishing their names in the newspapers. For a school teacher or a clerk, an arrest meant the loss of a job. For Tommy Kirk, it meant the end of his life. It meant total, irreversible annihilation. To cope with this high-wire act, the chemical crutches became essential. What started as recreational experimentation with pills turned into a survival mechanism. He discovered barbiturates, reds, and yellow jackets. They were the perfect antidote to his anxiety. They slowed his racing heart. They blurred the sharp edges of his fear. They numbed the voice in his head that screamed he was sick, broken, and perverted. We must understand the psychology of the time to understand Tommy's pain. He didn't just fear society's judgment. He internalized it. He believed what the world said about men like him. He viewed his own desires as a pathology, a defect in his soul that he couldn't fix. He later admitted to feeling a profound sense of self-loathing. He didn't want to be gay. He wanted to be the person Walt Disney thought he was. He wanted to be the person his mother bragged about. The drugs allowed him to briefly forget that he was at war with his own nature. The weekends became a blur of parties and pills. He would disappear into the canyon homes of other closeted actors or wealthy patrons of the arts, losing days to a haze of intoxication. It was a form of slow-motion suicide. He was trying to erase himself, to dissolve the tension of his existence in a chemically induced fog. Yet Monday morning would always come. The studio limousine would arrive. The makeup artists would apply the foundation to hide the dark circles. The director would call action, and Tommy Kirk would snap back into character, delivering the wholesome, wide-eyed performance that made millions of dollars. The dissonance was schizophrenic. He was navigating two incompatible realities, and the strain was causing hairline fractures in his sanity. In 1963, Disney cast him in The Misadventures of Merlin Jones. It was a pivotal moment. The film was a low-budget comedy about a college student who invents a mind-reading helmet. It was silly, fluffy, and formulaic, but it was also a test. The studio was transitioning him from teenager to young adult college student. They were trying to see if his stardom could mature. Tommy threw himself into the role of Merlin Jones. He played the eccentric inventor with a frantic energy that worked for the character. The film was shot quickly, cheaply, and without much fanfare, but unexpectedly, it became a massive sleeper hit. It made a fortune relative to its cost. The success of Merlin Jones proved that the public still loved Tommy Kirk. They loved his face. They loved his voice. He was still bankable. This success should have been a safety net. In a Hollywood, profit usually buys forgiveness. If you are making money, the executives will look the other way on almost anything. But Disney was different. The profit was important, but the brand was God. And the rumors about Tommy were starting to seep out of the underground and into the ears of the studio fixers. There were close calls. There were nights when he stumbled home too late or was seen in the wrong part of town with the wrong crowd. The studio's security apparatus, a network of private investigators and police contacts, was legendary. They knew everything. They likely knew about the pills. They likely knew about the bars. For a while, they tolerated it, perhaps hoping it was a phase, or perhaps simply calculating that he was still too profitable to discard. They protected him, covering up minor indiscretions, keeping his name out of the police blotters. But protection at Disney was not an act of benevolence. It was an act of ownership. They didn't protect Tommy Kirk, the human being. They protected Tommy Kirk, the asset. But the asset was becoming volatile. Emboldened by the drugs and the sheer exhaustion of hiding, Tommy began to get careless. He started taking risks that were borderline suicidal. He stopped checking the exits when he entered a room. He stopped filtering his gaze. He was a young man pushed to the brink of his endurance, and a part of him, the subconscious, self-destructive part, wanted to get caught. He wanted the charade to end one way or another. It was in this atmosphere of impending doom that he met a boy at a public swimming pool in Burbank. The encounter was innocuous at first, just a conversation, a connection. The boy was 15 years old. To Tommy, who was only 21 but emotionally arrested, the age gap might not have felt as significant as it was. But in the eyes of the law and in the moral ledger of the time, it was the crossing of the Rubicon. They began to see each other. It wasn't a sordid affair in a back alley. It was lonely, desperate attempts at intimacy. Tommy, starved for affection, projected his need onto this relationship. He invited the boy to his world, perhaps naively thinking that his stardom offered a kind of immunity field. He forgot that he was living in a glass house and he was handing stones to the world. The relationship was the final crack in the dam. It wasn't just partying anymore. It was a tangible, specific violation of the social contract. And unlike the anonymous encounters in the dark bars of West Hollywood, this involved a local boy, a local family, and a mother who was watching. As 1963 drew to a close, Tommy Kirk was standing on the summit of his career. Merlin Jones was a hit. A sequel was already being planned. He was rich. He was young. The world saw a prince. But inside the castle, the guards were already sharpening their knives. The good luck charm had run out of magic. The silence that had protected him for so long was about to be broken by a scream, and the fall from the top of the mountain would be swift, brutal, and absolute. He went to sleep every night in his expensive bed, in the house his acting had bought, unaware that the eviction notice was already being drafted. Not by a landlord, but by the man he considered a father. The year of the Exile was approaching. The year 1964 broke over Los Angeles with the deceptive calm of a tsunami receding before the crash. To the outside world, Tommy Kirk was impenetrable. He was the star of The Misadventures of Merlin Jones, a film that was currently filling theaters and filling the studio's coffers. He was 22 years old, a millionaire, and a household name. But the private life he had so carefully compartmentalized was about to bleed into his public existence with catastrophic force. The incident that would dismantle his life did not happen on a soundstage or at a premiere. It happened in the mundane, sun-drenched quiet of a Burbank public park, a place where the gods of Hollywood were never supposed to be seen. The relationship with the 15-year-old boy he had met at the pool had moved from tentative conversations to something more intimate. It was a connection forged in loneliness, a desperate grasp for affection by a young man who had been denied the right to love openly. Tommy, in his naivety, perhaps believed that the walls of the Magic Kingdom were high enough to block the view of the outside world. He was wrong. In the suburbs of 1964, eyes were everywhere. The boy's mother discovered the relationship. It is not recorded exactly how. A diary entry, a witnessed glance, a rumor, but the discovery was nuclear. She did not go to the gossip columns. She did not go to the police, at least not initially. She went to the source of the power. She contacted the Walt Disney Studios. She threatened to expose the fact that the studio's golden boy, the face of American morality, was corrupting her son. The reaction within the executive offices of Disney was immediate, silent, and terrifyingly efficient. There was no crisis management meeting to discuss rehabilitation. There was no legal team assembled to defend Tommy's character. In the corporate calculus of the time, homosexuality was not a PR problem to be managed. It was a contagion to be excised. The machinery that had spent a decade building the myth of Tommy Kirk reversed its gears in an instant to destroy him. Tommy was summoned to the office. He likely walked in expecting a discussion about the sequel to Merlin Jones or a new contract negotiation. Instead, he was met with the cold, bureaucratic face of institutional rejection. He was told bluntly and without euphemism that he was fired. His contract was terminated effective immediately. There was no severance. There was no thank you for your service. But the true knife to the heart was not the loss of the paycheck. It was the silence of the father figure. Tommy waited for Walt. He waited for the man who had called him a good luck charm, the man who had patted him on the back and welcomed him into the family, to step in. He expected a lecture, perhaps, a scolding, a punishment, but he expected contact. Walt Disney never called. He never wrote. He never appeared. Years later, the pain of that silence still vibrated in Tommy's voice when he spoke of it. "He never looked at me again," Tommy would say. Walt Disney, the architect of dreams, was also a man of ruthless Victorian morality. When a toy was broken, he didn't fix it. He threw it away. To Walt, Tommy's actions were a personal betrayal, a stain on the pristine white gloves of the mouse. The door to the kingdom was slammed shut and the locks were changed before Tommy even reached the parking lot. Being escorted off the Disney lot was a surreal nightmare. This was the place where he had grown up. The sound stages were his playground. The commissary was his dining room. The crew were his uncles and cousins. He was being exiled from the only home he had ever known. As he drove past the iconic water tower for the last time, he wasn't just an unemployed actor. He was an orphan. The identity of Disney star was ripped away, leaving a terrified, drug-dependent 22-year-old man standing in the glare of the California sun with absolutely nothing to shield him. The news of the firing didn't hit the papers immediately. The studio, protecting its own reputation as much as Tommy's, kept the reason vague. They let him drift away into the fog. But in Hollywood, secrets are the currency of the realm. The whispers started instantly. Tommy Kirk is out. Tommy Kirk is toxic. Don't touch him. The phone stopped ringing. The scripts stopped coming. The major studios, Paramount, MGM, Fox, all closed their doors. They didn't need to be told officially. The smell of scandal was enough to repel them. Tommy Kirk was radioactive, desperate for work, desperate to prove he still existed. He signed with the only studio that would take him, American International Pictures, AIP. If Disney was the Ritz-Carlton of Hollywood, AIP was a roadside motel with neon signs buzzing in the rain. Run by Samuel Z. Arkoff and James H. Nicholson, AIP was the factory of B-movies, churning out beach party flicks, biker movies, and low-budget horror. They didn't care about morality, they cared about ticket sales. They saw Tommy Kirk not as a fallen angel, but as a recognizable face they could buy at a discount. The transition was jarring. Tommy went from the meticulous, high-budget productions of Swiss Family Robinson to the chaotic, slapdash sets of Pajama Party. He was cast alongside Annette Funicello again, who was also making the transition to beach movies. But the dynamic had shifted. At Disney, they were royalty. Here, they were commodities in a factory line of bikinis and surfboards. Tommy tried to act. He tried to summon the old charm. But watching Pajama Party, or The Ghost in the Invisible Bikini, you see a man who is chemically altered. The drugs were no longer a recreational escape. They were the fuel that got him out of bed. He was high on set. He was numb. He delivered his lines with a glazed, frantic energy, his eyes often looking past the camera, staring at a future that was rapidly shrinking. He hated the movies. He hated the scripts. He felt the humiliation of going from Old Yeller, a film that defined a nation, to Mars Needs Women, a film that became a punchline. In Mars Needs Women, Tommy played a Martian. The symbolism was too cruel to be accidental. He was an alien. He didn't belong on Earth. He was just trying to mimic human behavior while his internal atmosphere collapsed. And then came Christmas Eve, 1964. If the firing from Disney was the private execution, this was the public beheading. It was the night before Christmas. The rest of America was wrapping presents, singing carols, and preparing for a day of family joy. Tommy Kirk was at a party in a house in the Hollywood Hills. It was a wild party by the standards of the day, filled with the castaways of the industry, the bohemians, the people who lived on the edge. Tommy was heavily intoxicated. He had a stash of marijuana and a pocket full of barbiturates, Seconal and Nembutal, the dolls that Jacqueline Suzanne would later write about in Valley of the Dolls. He was trying to obliterate the memory of the worst year of his life. He was trying to forget that tomorrow was Christmas, and he had been banished by his father, Walt. The Los Angeles Police Department didn't care about his sorrow. They raided the house. The door burst open. The flashlights cut through the smoke, the shouting, the confusion. Tommy was searched. The drugs were found. The arrest of a Disney star on drug charges was not a small story. It was a bonfire. The press descended with the vicious glee of predators who smell blood. The headlines the next morning were devastating. Disney star arrested on drug charges. Old Yeller boy in narcotics raid. The juxtaposition was irresistible. The boy who was the symbol of purity was now a dope fiend. The photos of Tommy being led away looking dazed, disheveled, and terrified were plastered across the country. It was the final nail in the coffin of Travis Coates. The public didn't just turn away, they turned against him. They felt betrayed. How could he do this to them? How could he ruin their fantasy? The fallout was absolute. Even AIP, the studio of exploitation, balked. They threatened to fire him from the films he was currently shooting. The legal system ground him down. He was eventually cleared of the most serious charges due to procedural errors in the search. But the verdict in the court of public opinion was guilty, with no possibility of parole. Tommy retreated into his house in the Hollywood Hills, pulling the shades down against the world. He was 23 years old, and his life was effectively over. The silence in the house was deafening. The phone didn't ring for work anymore. It rang with death threats or prank calls from people wanting to scream at the faggot junkie. This was the nadir. This was the bottom of the well. The drugs took total control. He began to inject. He stopped eating. He stopped bathing. The handsome face that had graced the cover of Tiger Beat became gaunt, the eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness and chemical burn. He later described this period as a living death. He would sit for hours staring at the wall, replaying the firing scene in his head. He never looked at me again. The rejection looped infinitely. He fantasized about suicide. He thought about driving his car off Mulholland Drive. He thought about taking the whole bottle of pills instead of just half. I had no self-respect, he would later tell an interviewer, his voice trembling with the memory. I had nothing. I was financially ruined. I was emotionally ruined. I was a pariah. The few friends he had left tried to help, but addiction is a fortress that is hard to breach. Annette tried to reach out, but he pushed her away, ashamed to let her see what he had become. He didn't want the queen to see the leper. The years 1965 to 1968 were a blur of minor arrests, hospitalizations, and cheap movies that barely saw a theatrical release. He did Village of the Giants, where he played a scientist who invents a goo that makes teenagers grow to 50 feet tall. It was garbage. He knew it was garbage. Every time he stepped on a set like that, a little more of his dignity eroded. He was becoming a cautionary tale. Mothers would point to the newspaper stories about him and tell their children, "Don't end up like Tommy Kirk." He had become the boogeyman of Hollywood, the example of what happens when you stray from the path of righteousness. But beneath the addiction, beneath the shame, there was still an ember of the boy who had survived the poverty of Kentucky. There was a toughness in Tommy Kirk that Disney hadn't given him, and Disney couldn't take away. It was the grit of the survivor. As the 60s bled into the 70s and the summer of love turned into the dark hangover of the Manson era, Tommy Kirk was still alive. He was damaged, yes. He was forgotten, yes. But he was breathing. And in the silence of his exile, stripped of the fame that had been his cage, he began to look at his life and wonder if there was another way to live, a way that didn't require a camera, a script, or a lie. By the time the 1970s arrived, the world had fundamentally changed. The optimism of the post-war era had evaporated, replaced by the cynical, gritty reality of Vietnam, Watergate, and a cultural malaise that hung over America like smog. For Tommy Kirk, this new decade wasn't a fresh start. It was a wasteland. He was approaching 30, an age where most men are building their careers, starting families, and cementing their place in the world. But Tommy was living in reverse. He had already lived a lifetime of success, and now he was wading through the wreckage of the aftermath. The phone had stopped ringing entirely. The B-movie offers from American International Pictures had dried up. Not because Tommy couldn't act, but because he was uninsurable. His reputation as a drug risk was etched in stone. He was a liability. The few roles he did manage to scrape together during this period were humiliating cameos or non-speaking parts in films so obscure they barely exist in archives today. He was a ghost haunting the fringes of the industry that had once crowned him king. The addiction that had started as a coping mechanism had metastasized into a full-time occupation. He was essentially unemployable. The money from Old Yeller and Swiss Family Robinson was gone, burned up in a haze of pills, legal fees, and the predatory economics of Hollywood accounting. He was living in cheap apartments, moving frequently, dodging creditors, and dodging the memories that ambushed him whenever he saw a Disney billboard. It is difficult to overstate the psychological devastation of this specific kind of fall. When you are famous at 15, your entire identity is constructed around being the star. You are validated by applause. You are defined by the camera. When those things are removed, you don't just lose a job. You lose yourself. Tommy didn't know who he was if he wasn't Travis Coates. He looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, a gaunt, angry, terrified stranger who had been abandoned by his father, Walt, and rejected by his family, the audience. In 1973, he reached the terminus. The drugs had taken everything they could take without taking his life. He woke up one morning, or perhaps it was afternoon, time had lost its meaning, and realized he had a binary choice. He could die, likely in a sordid, lonely way that would warrant a 3-inch obituary in Variety mocking his fall. Or he could do the hardest thing imaginable. He could become a nobody. He chose to live. The decision to get clean was not a cinematic moment. There was no swelling orchestra, no dramatic intervention by old friends. It was a quiet, gritty resolve born of exhaustion. He was simply tired of the pain. He checked himself into recovery. He went through the agony of withdrawal, the sweating, the shaking, the terrifying clarity of a brain coming back online after years of sedation. But getting clean was only the first step. The harder part was answering the question, now what? He had no skills. He had never attended college. He had never held a real job. He didn't know how to type. He didn't know how to fix cars. He didn't know how to sell insurance. All he knew how to do was hit a mark, find his key light, and cry on cue. And the world had made it clear it didn't want him to do that anymore. He had to reinvent himself from the ground up. He had to learn how to be a civilian. He tried various odd jobs, stumbling through the classified ads of the Los Angeles Times. It was a humbling, often humiliating process. Imagine walking into an interview for a minimum wage job, and the manager looks at you, squinting, trying to place your face. The moment of recognition, "Hey, aren't you?" was followed by a look of confusion, and then inevitably pity. What is the Disney kid doing here? What went wrong? Tommy learned to armor himself against the pity. He learned to swallow his pride. He eventually found his answer in the industry that would define his middle years. As we saw at the beginning of our story, carpet and upholstery cleaning. He bought the equipment. He printed business cards that simply said, "Kirk's Upholstery." He didn't use his fame to get clients. In fact, he did the opposite. He tried to remain anonymous. He wanted to be judged solely on the quality of his cleaning. This period of his life, the long silence, lasted for nearly 2 decades. Throughout the late 70s and the entirety of the 1980s, while Hollywood was churning out Star Wars and E.T., Tommy Kirk was driving his white van through the suburbs of Los Angeles. He was entering the homes of people who had watched him grow up. There were moments of surreal collision. He would be cleaning a sofa in a living room in Encino, and the television would be on. A rerun of Old Yeller or the Shaggy Dog would start playing. Tommy would be on his knees, scrubbing a stain while his younger self flickered on the screen just a few feet away. The boy on the screen was crying. The man on the floor was sweating. Sometimes the homeowners would recognize him. The reaction was almost always the same: shock. They couldn't reconcile the two images. They would ask him, "What happened? Why aren't you acting? Did you lose all your money?" These questions were invasive, painful reminders of his exile. But Tommy developed a quiet dignity in answering them. "I'm retired," he would say, or "I like this work." He refused to play the victim for them. He refused to give them the tragic narrative they were fishing for. He was paying his bills. He was sober. He was alive. That was enough. He also began to make peace with his sexuality during these years. The lavender scare had faded, replaced by the burgeoning gay rights movement. West Hollywood was becoming a sanctuary. Tommy wasn't an activist. He didn't march in parades or give speeches. He was too scarred by the 60s for that. But he allowed himself to live. He found partners. He made friends who didn't care about Disney. He built a small private life that belonged only to him. For the first time, he wasn't Tommy Kirk, the Disney star. He was just Tommy. He was a guy who liked to read science fiction novels, a guy who struggled with his weight, a guy who worried about the price of gas for his work van. He was reclaiming the humanity that the studio system had stolen from him. However, the shadow of Disney was long. Even as he scrubbed floors, the legacy of his work continued to grow. Old Yeller was re-released in theaters. It was released on VHS. A new generation of children was traumatized by the death of the dog. A new generation fell in love with Travis Coates. Tommy watched this from a distance. He felt a strange dissociation from his work. He knew he was good in those movies. He was proud of the acting, but he couldn't watch them without feeling the phantom pain of the betrayal. To the world, those movies were classics. To him, they were home movies of a hostage situation. He rarely spoke of Walt Disney. When he did, it was with a complex mixture of reverence and hurt. He couldn't deny the man's genius, nor could he deny the man's cruelty. He was like a son who had been disowned by a great king. He still admired the kingdom, even though he was banished to the peasant villages outside the walls. In the late 1980s, a subtle shift began to occur. The "where are they now" culture began to rise. Journalists and fans started looking for the lost icons of the 50s and 60s. They found Tommy. They found him not in a mansion, but in a modest apartment. They found him not bitter and raving, but quiet and reflective. The interviews from this period are fascinating. He is guarded, yes, but there is a lack of self-pity that is striking. He owns his mistakes. He admits to the drug use. He admits to the wild lifestyle, but he also quietly asserts the injustice of what happened to him. "I don't blame anybody but myself," he would say, taking more responsibility than perhaps he should have. "I was a mess, but I think I was treated harshly." This understated admission began to change the narrative. The public, now older and perhaps wiser, began to look back at the treatment of Tommy Kirk with a more critical eye. They started to see the cracks in the Disney facade. They started to realize that the wholesome values of the 1950s had a body count. And yet Tommy kept cleaning carpets. He didn't use the renewed interest to try for a comeback. He didn't want to go back to the circus. He knew that the Hollywood of the 1980s was just as vicious as the Hollywood of the 1960s, just with different drugs and different lies. He preferred the honesty of dirt. There is a specific kind of heroism in this middle chapter of his life. It is not the heroism of the gunfighter he played in Old Yeller. It is the heroism of endurance. It is the heroism of the man who wakes up every morning, despite the shame, despite the lost potential, despite the whispers, and goes to work. He was rebuilding his soul one living room at a time. He found solace in writing. He wrote poetry and short stories, mostly for himself. He reconnected with a few people from his past who had remained loyal, primarily Annette Funicello. When Annette was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, Tommy was devastated. He saw the toll that life had taken on both of them, the two brightest stars of the Mickey Mouse Club, both battered by fate, but their bond remained unbreakable. She was the only one who truly knew what it was like inside the cage. As the 1990s approached, the carpet cleaning business began to take a toll on his body. The physical labor was hard for a man approaching 50. His back ached, his knees creaked, but he kept going because he had to. There were no residuals from the Disney movies. In the era when he signed his contracts, home video didn't exist. He didn't get a dime from the millions of VHS tapes of Old Yeller being sold at Walmart. He was the face on the box, but he couldn't afford to buy the box. This financial injustice was a sore point, but he bore it with a stoic resignation. He lived simply. He didn't need much. He had his sobriety, which he guarded fiercely. He knew that one slip, one moment of weakness, would send him back to the hell of 1965. And he promised himself he would never go back there. He had survived the death of his career. He had survived the death of his reputation. He was currently surviving the death of his dreams. But he was about to discover that history has a strange way of correcting itself, and that sometimes the exile is allowed to come home, not as a prince, but as something far more formidable, a survivor. As the millennium turned, a curious phenomenon began to reshape the landscape of American pop culture. The aggressive modernism of the 1990s, the grunge, the irony, the cynicism, began to soften into a yearning for the past. The internet, then in its chaotic adolescence, became a tool not just for looking forward, but for looking back. Fan sites, message boards, and digital archives began to spring up, dedicated to preserving the minutiae of the 20th century. In this digital excavation, a generation of adults began to search for the artifacts of their childhood. They searched for the toys they had played with, the songs they had listened to, and the faces they had loved. Inevitably, they searched for Tommy Kirk. For decades, Tommy had existed in the cultural blind spot. He was a face on a VHS box in a blockbuster video, a static image from a bygone era. But to the fans now connecting online, he was a living mystery. Where is Travis Coates? Is he alive? Did he really become a drug addict? Is it true he cleans carpets? The whispers that had once been confined to Hollywood gossip circles were now being discussed openly by fans who felt a sense of protective ownership over him. This resurgence of interest coincided with the explosion of the convention circuit. Autograph shows and nostalgia conventions moved from the fringes of hotel ballrooms to massive convention centers. Promoters realized that there was a serious money to be made in reconnecting aging stars with their aging fan bases. They began to track down the icons of the 1950s and 60s, offering them cash guarantees to sit at a table for a weekend and sign glossies. When the call first came to Tommy, he was hesitant. The idea of sitting in a room and charging people for his signature felt strange, perhaps even pathetic. He was a working man. He scrubbed upholstery. He had built a life on the dignity of anonymity. To step back into the spotlight, even the dim spotlight of a nostalgia convention, was to risk exposing himself to the ridicule he had fled 30 years prior. He feared the questions. He feared the judgment. He feared that no one would show up, but he needed the money. The carpet business paid the bills, but it didn't build a retirement fund, and physically the work was breaking him down. So, with a deep breath and a stomach full of nerves, Tommy Kirk agreed to appear. He walked into his first convention bracing for impact. He expected to see the tabloid reporters who had destroyed him in 1964. He expected to see sneering critics. Instead, he saw a line. It was a long line, snaking through the aisles. It was filled with men and women in their 40s and 50s. Some held tattered copies of old Yeller books. Some held original movie posters. Some held nothing but a desire to shake his hand. When Tommy sat down at the table, he didn't see judgment in their eyes. He saw gratitude. "You were my first crush," a woman would say, blushing like a teenager. "I cried for 3 days after Old Yeller," a man would admit, gripping Tommy's hand. "It was the first time I ever saw my dad cry. Your movies were the only time my family sat together without fighting." For hours, Tommy listened. He realized something profound that the isolation of his exile had hidden from him. The scandal hadn't mattered to them. The drug arrest hadn't mattered. The firing hadn't mattered. To these people, he wasn't a fallen star or a security risk. He was a part of the fabric of their lives. He was the brother they never had, the boyfriend they dreamed of, the friend who taught them about courage. The conventions became a form of therapy. Each autograph signed was a small act of reclamation. Each handshake repaired a microscopic fracture in his self-esteem. He began to realize that the shame he had carried for 40 years was a burden he had imposed upon himself, fueled by a studio system that was long dead. The public had forgiven him decades ago. He was the only one who hadn't got the memo. He reconnected with his on-screen brother, Kevin Corcoran, the actor who had played Moochie in Old Yeller and Swiss Family Robinson. Kevin had taken a different path. He had survived the transition to adulthood by moving behind the camera, becoming a successful assistant director and producer. He had stayed inside the fortress. Seeing them together at conventions was a moving sight, the two Coates brothers, now gray-haired men, laughing, sharing inside jokes, survivors of a unique and strange childhood that only they could understand. Kevin's presence was a grounding force for Tommy, a living link to the days when they were just boys playing in the dirt on the Disney backlot. This wave of goodwill from the public eventually crashed against the gates of the Walt Disney Company itself. By the mid-2000s, the Disney Corporation was a very different beast than the fiefdom of Walt's era. It was a global media conglomerate. The moral clauses of the 1950s were ancient history. The company was now employing openly gay actors, writers, and executives. The Lavender Scare was a dark chapter in a history book that few bothered to read. Under the leadership of CEO Bob Iger and the studio chiefs, there was a concerted effort to honor the studio's heritage. They recognized that the Disney Legends program, an award established in 1987 to honor individuals who had made a significant contribution to the Disney legacy, had a glaring omission. How could they have a Hall of Fame without Travis Coates? How could they honor the history of the studio without honoring the boy who had starred in its most profitable and beloved live-action films? The continued omission of Tommy Kirk was beginning to look less like an oversight and more like pettiness. It was a scar that needed to be healed. In 2006, the decision was made. A letter was drafted. A phone call was placed. When Tommy received the news that he was to be inducted as a Disney legend, his initial reaction was a complex cocktail of emotions. Shock, certainly. Cynicism, perhaps. Now, he must have thought, after 40 years? After you threw me away like garbage? After I spent half my life scrubbing floors because you blacklisted me? He would have been within his rights to tell them to go to hell. He could have used the moment to publicly denounce the studio, to air the grievances that had festered for decades. It would have been a spectacular media moment. But Tommy Kirk was tired of anger. He was tired of being the victim. He realized that holding on to the bitterness was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. He also knew that Walt Disney, the man who had fired him, was long dead. The people running the company now were not the ones who had hurt him. They were offering an olive branch. He accepted. The ceremony took place in October 2006 at the Disney lot in Burbank. Returning to the lot was a surreal, ghostly experience. The geography was the same. The animation building, the sound stages, the streets where he had ridden his bicycle as a 14-year-old. But the atmosphere was transformed. It was corporate, sleek, modern. Tommy walked onto the stage dressed in a suit, looking every bit the dignified elder statesman. He was 64 years old. The boyish face was lined, but the eyes, those sad, expressive eyes, were unmistakable. He was in good company. That year's inductees included heavy hitters like Sir Elton John and news anchor Peter Jennings. But when Tommy's name was announced, the applause had a different texture. It wasn't just respectful, it was emotional. The people in that auditorium, many of them longtime Disney employees, knew the story. They knew the Exile. They knew that this wasn't just an award, it was an apology. Tommy stepped to the podium. He held the heavy bronze statue, shaped like Mickey Mouse's hand holding a magic wand. He looked out at the sea of faces. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He smiled. "I want to thank the Disney Company," he said, his voice steady. "I have not been on this lot in over 40 years. He spoke briefly. He acknowledged his co-stars. He acknowledged the work. And then he said something that stunned those who expected bitterness. He spoke of Walt Disney. He didn't demonize Walt. He didn't paint him as a monster. He spoke of him as a complex man who had given a poor kid from Kentucky a chance to see the world. "I don't blame Walt," Tommy said in interviews around that time. "He was a man of his time. I was a problem he didn't know how to solve. He did what he thought he had to do." This forgiveness was the ultimate victory. By forgiving Disney, Tommy freed himself. He cut the last chain that bound him to the trauma of 1964. He wasn't the exiled prince anymore. He was a legend. He had survived the wilderness, and he had returned on his own terms. The reunion with Kevin Corcoran at the ceremony was particularly poignant. Kevin, also inducted that year, stood by his side. They posed for photos, Travis and Arliss, grown up, scarred, but standing tall. It was the closing of a circle that had been broken for half a century. After the ceremony, life didn't magically transform into a fairy tale. Tommy didn't suddenly get cast in blockbusters. He didn't move into a mansion. He went back to his quiet life, but something had shifted internally. The shame was gone. The official seal of approval from the entity that had defined his existence meant that he could finally look at his own legacy without wincing. He could watch Old Yeller now. He could see the boy on the screen not as a reminder of what he had lost, but as a gift he had given to the world. He retired from the carpet cleaning business shortly after. His body couldn't take it anymore. He lived a modest life, mostly in Redding, California, and later in Las Vegas. He lived on a pension, Social Security, and the income from appearances. It wasn't the lavish retirement of a movie star, but it was a life of peace. He spent his days reading. He loved science fiction and history. He was an autodidact, a man who had missed out on formal education, but had devoured libraries. He was intelligent, thoughtful, and deeply private. He had a small circle of friends who protected him. He was done with the scene. He had no interest in Hollywood parties or the desperate cling to relevancy that plagues so many aging actors. He was content to be Tommy. However, the universe had one last act of cruelty to play. As he entered his 70s, his health began to decline. The years of hard labor, combined with the lingering effects of the abuse his body had taken in the 60s, caught up with him. He struggled with mobility. He struggled with isolation. But even as his body failed, his spirit remained curiously intact. He became a sort of philosopher of his own life. When journalists managed to track him down for the occasional interview, they were often surprised by his candor and his lack of self-pity. He would talk about the Disney curse, the string of tragedies that befell the child stars of his era. Bobby Driscoll, the star of Treasure Island, found dead in an abandoned tenement at age 31. The kids from Mary Poppins who struggled. He saw himself as the lucky one. "I survived," he would say. "I don't know how, but I did. I'm the one who walked away." This perspective was his armor. He viewed his survival not as a triumph of will, but as a stroke of cosmic luck. He knew how close he had come to the edge. He remembered the nights with the needle. He remembered the suicidal ideation. The fact that he was sitting in a recliner in Las Vegas watching the sunset instead of lying in a grave in 1968 was a miracle he never took for granted. As the 2000s progressed, Tommy faded further from the public eye. The conventions became too physically taxing. He stopped traveling. He became a voice on the phone to his old friends, a memory to his fans. But the world hadn't forgotten him. The internet kept his legacy alive. New YouTube channels analyzed his films. Blogs discussed his significance as a gay icon, a title he found amusing and slightly baffling. He had never intended to be a martyr for the cause. He had just tried to survive being gay in a time when it was illegal. But history has a way of drafting people into armies they didn't volunteer for. To a new generation of LGBTQ plus youth, Tommy Kirk was a pioneer. He was proof that the system could hurt you, but it couldn't erase you. In his final years, he lived alone. This solitude was a choice. After a lifetime of being owned by the public, by the studio, by the expectations of others, he hoarded his privacy like gold. He wanted his final chapter to be unscripted. He wanted it to be silent. The house in Las Vegas was quiet. The accolades, the Disney Legend trophy, the photos with Annette, they were there, on the shelves, but they didn't define the room. The room was defined by the books he read, the simple meals he ate, the quiet dignity of a man who had scrubbed the floors of strangers to reclaim his soul. He was waiting, not for a role, not for a check, not for an apology. He was waiting for the final curtain, not with fear, but with the weary patience of a worker who has finished a very long shift and is just waiting to punch the clock one last time. On September 28, 2021, the silence in the modest Las Vegas home became eternal. Tommy Kirk, the boy who had once commanded the attention of the entire world, passed away in his sleep. He was 79 years old. There were no cameras rolling. There were no directors shouting instructions. There was just the quiet, inevitable stop of a heart that had been breaking and healing in cycles for nearly 8 decades. The news did not break immediately. It traveled slowly, filtering through the network of former child stars and industry veterans before reaching the public. It was Paul Peterson, a fellow advocate for former child actors and a longtime friend, who eventually announced it to the world. Peterson's words were heavy with the weight of shared history. He didn't just announce a death, he acknowledged a battle. "Please know that Tommy Kirk loved you, his fans," Peterson wrote. "You lifted him up when an industry let him down. He was not bitter. He was proud of what he did." When the headlines finally hit the internet, Disney legend Tommy Kirk dies at 79. The reaction was a digital echo of the grief that had greeted Old Yeller 60 years prior. But this grief was more complex. It was layered with nostalgia, regret, and a belated understanding of exactly what this man had endured. Social media feeds filled with images of Travis Coates, of Wilby Daniels, of Ernest Robinson. People shared clips of him crying over the dog, clips of him laughing with Annette. But amidst the tributes, there was a palpable sense of apology. The obituaries in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times didn't just list his filmography, they told the story of his exile. They mentioned the firing. They mentioned the sexuality. They mentioned the carpet cleaning. For the first time, the mainstream narrative of Tommy Kirk's life was complete. He was no longer just the star. He was the survivor. The world was finally looking at the whole picture, acknowledging the cracks in the porcelain. His death marked the severing of one of the last living links to the golden age of Walt Disney. With Tommy gone, the era of the studio system's absolute moral control felt even more distant, a relic of a time when a corporation could own a human soul. But his passing also forced a reckoning with the cost of that era. We look back at the 1950s with a warm, fuzzy gaze, but Tommy's life serves as a sharp reminder that the warmth was often purchased with the cold-blooded destruction of anyone who didn't fit the mold. Tommy Kirk is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of institutionalized cruelty. Consider the trajectory. He was a child laborer, supporting a family that viewed him as an asset. He was a closeted gay man in an era that criminalized his existence. He was a drug addict who stared into the abyss of overdose. He was a pariah blacklisted by the most powerful company in entertainment. And yet, he didn't die young. He didn't die in a gutter. He didn't die bitter. This is the miracle of his story. He chose the hardest path available to a fallen star, the path of the ordinary. He put down the script and picked up the cleaning wand. He scrubbed the floors of the middle class to buy back his dignity. There's a profound, quiet heroism in that 20-year period of his life that eclipses anything he ever did on film. It takes more courage to clean a stranger's upholstery when you used to be a millionaire than it does to shoot a rabid dog on a movie set. Tommy Kirk was not a flag bearer, but his existence was an extraordinary act of resistance. The first Disney star to be fired for being gay, He stood firm in the face of the world's death sentence, quietly rebuilding his life. He proved that life goes on even after being banished from the walls. The old Yeller we see today is no longer a simple sad fairy tale. Travis's tears on screen are not a drama, but Tommy Kirk's sincere regret for his lost youth. It is the only truth portrayed in a brilliant fake drama, a documentary that records the boy's inner self. But it is disrespectful to remember him only as a victim of tragedy. He was a winner who ripped apart the tragic script imposed by Hollywood and wrote his own new ending. Instead of the glittering halo, he found peace in honest work, not in the applause of others, but in his own life. The boy on screen will never age, but we all know the true courage hidden behind that face. He has survived the gunshots in the movies, persevered through the harsh realities of life, and finally found peace in his soul. Rest in peace, Travis. You can put down your gun now. Your long and arduous mission is over.